Britain is honouring the life of Queen Elizabeth II with a state funeral steeped in tradition on Monday. The Queen, the UK's longest reigning monarch, died on September 8 after a rule spanning 7 decades. She was 96. The funeral service is taking place at Westminster Abbey in London, where the Queen was crowned 69 years ago and where she was married to her husband Prince Philip 75 years ago. Presidents, prime ministers, princes and emperors, as well as empress, are among the dignitaries paying their final respects, a testament to the Queen's far-reaching appeal and deft diplomacy. Thousands of people flocked to the Abbey and streets along the procession route from central London to Windsor, hoping to catch a glimpse of the Queen's flag-draped coffin. It travels by hearse to her final resting place in St. George's Chapel, within the grounds of Windsor Castle. Hello and welcome to this special coverage on the funeral of Her Majesty the Queen Elizabeth II. Joining me in our discussion today, experts from the UK, we have Professor Pippa Catterall, Professor of History and Policy, University of Westminster, as well as Dr. Yvonne Ridley, political analyst and former Royal Palace correspondent, and Mr. Donald Lowry, Senior Fellow in History, University of Oxford from UK. Madam and gentlemen, thank you so much for agreeing to be with us. And before we delve into discussion, let me share with you, dear viewers, this info ahead of the Queen's funeral on Monday. Some 500 foreign dignitaries representing nearly 200 nations are attending the Queen's funeral. Simply managing all their movements and keeping them safe is going to be a huge task. To help with the districts and security men were being asked to arrive at Westminster Abbey in buses provided by the UK government. They and the public are protected by some 10,000 uniformed police officers from every corner of the country. Snipers are stationed on rooftops and surveillance drones are flying overhead. And from the Welsh Cavalry to the Royal Air Forces, more than 2,500 uniformed military personnel are on hand in terms of the cost of scale. A close comparison is likely to be William and Kate's wedding. Security for that event cost nearly £6.4 million, but the state funeral is a major diplomatic operation. So let's start with you, Dr. Yvonne. What's your comment about the cost of all this lavish ceremony and all this security?
Well, of course it's going to run into millions. The unfortunate thing is that most people in Britain are bracing themselves for economic hardship, which is unprecedented because of increasingly high energy bills. People are going to face stark decisions between heating and eating. It's that bad. And so these eye-watering figures are bound to raise eyebrows in some circles. I'm sure that argument will be countered from a tourism point of view, that this sort of British pageantry and sense of history brings in tourists. So it's something that I'm sure will cause debates in households up and down the country.
Absolutely. And here, let me bring in Professor Donald Lowry. Speaking about all this pageantry and the lavish burial ceremony amidst an economic crisis where the average British citizen is struggling to make ends meet, and that reconcile in some ways that sort of pageant and pomp of the monarchy with the ordinary sort of grind of the cost of living crisis operation. If I may express my humble opinion as an observer, I would say that this is part of the British brand. You know, this is what distinguishes the British people from the rest of the world. People look at this country in awe and think there has been so much respect from all over the world to Her Majesty and to all this well-fashioned organization, let's say.
Well, I think opinion obviously is going to be divided. There will be those who will find it excessive, and there'll be those who think that it's a necessary thing to do. If when an American president passes away, there is pretty vast expense involved and a lot of pageantry, even in the United States. Not as ancient, but certainly security men and parades and so forth, or the same for a French president. I don't think one should be too I think this is too unique on that level. It's certainly more elaborate. It's older than the other institutions I mentioned. And of course, also the Queen was also head of the Commonwealth, but also head of state of a dozen other countries whose prime ministers are there. So it's not simply the same as any other national figure, national head of state elsewhere in Europe or indeed elsewhere. But I think the scale of the operation, with so many people coming and so many people, heads of state, both monarchical and elected, you can see that there would have to be an expensive thing, expensive gathering. But also among the ordinary people, of course, who are worried about the standard of the cost of living, are those people you see on your screen. I mean, they're also worried. You can be sure they're not all people who are quite happy about their impending fuel bills. So it's complicated, like most things. It's a complicated issue.
Yes, indeed. And let me bring Professor Pippa Catterall. Britain has drawn up a plan described as the largest operation to control security and protection in the history of the kingdom since World War II, as all agencies in London mobilise their efforts to bring this event out in a manner befitting, let's say, the Queen and her history, especially with large numbers of world leaders, preparations that the Queen personally participated in before, and 500 leaders from the world join in the funeral. That's a huge number. How big is this challenge raised by the British security forces, according to you?
Well, yeah, I mean, we can put this in context and say this is actually not, 6.4 million is not actually a huge cost in terms of the national budget. It's more or less a rounding error. So that's not to say that you couldn't buy a lot of meals for people with it, but this would have been planned for an awful long time, long before the current crises, which is to a large extent induced by poor political management over the last few years, rather than because of anything done by the monarchy. The other context is that if you look back at similar events in the past, so the last coronation in 1953, last major royal event of this kind was in the aftermath of the Second World War. You still had austerity, you still had rationing. The coronation of the Queen's father in 1937, you still had about 2 million people unemployed at that point in time. So there's not, it's not like this is hugely unusual in a sense, but if you're going to have that many people coming into the country, you certainly don't would expect to look after them in the style to which they would be accustomed. You also need to make sure that they are indeed secure. Not only all the high-profile visitors, President Biden, etc., but also all the crowds. If there was a major terrorist incident today as a result of these events, then the negative costs would be enormous. So it's if you like worth spending the money in that sense, because the cost, if there's any body killed, any human being of any kind killed as a result of poor security, then that would be down to the authorities as a dereliction of duty.
Very nice indeed. And Dr. Yvonne Ridley, since earlier you did tell me that it was quite lavish and perhaps maybe they could lower the cost or maybe make, let's say, the ceremony a little more humble, but would this be just for Her Majesty's?
Well, it's, as one of your guests said, it is a complicated issue. The Queen has devoted her entire life to serving her country. It's not a job, I think, that many people would actually want. In fact, I can't really imagine it's been that rewarding because there's been absolutely no time off. You know, she was working right up until 2 days before her death, when she was receiving the outgoing British Prime Minister and the new incoming British Prime Minister. So I think that I don't think anybody would seriously begrudge this farewell, but I don't think there is much of an appetite left in Britain for this sort of pomp and ceremony when we're heading towards an unprecedented period of hardship.
Very nice indeed. And speaking about all her service and public, let's say, service and duty, how could Queen Elizabeth II hold it all together? And how challenging do you think it's going to be for King Charles III? I mean, do the Republicans have a better round now with King Charles III?
Well, the Queen had an enormous staff. And when Charles became king, these things happen in an instant. More than 100 of his staff were made redundant. And, you know, this shows the enormity of the support network that is around the monarchy. And as I say, you know, we're in the 21st century now. When the Queen came to the throne in 1953, I think there were more than 100 monarchies around the world. Now there are less than 50, which is an indication really of a question mark over the future of any monarchy.
Yes, indeed. And Professor Donald Lowry, many observers and analysts see Elizabeth's death may serve as an opportunity for other nations to re-examine their relationship with the British monarchy and follow perhaps the Barbadian example once the mourning period ends. What is your comment about that?
Well, again, this is complicated. I don't adhere to the inevitability argument. Hello?
Yes,
Hello?
yes, I can hear you.
Sorry, my screen went for a second. I don't buy into the inevitability argument. Countries, including the West Indies, have actually, in referendum, defeated a Republican vote in recent years. And Barbados is a special case because they didn't require a referendum, and had they done so, it might not have gone that way. The other West Indian countries, in many cases, do require a referendum, and that may not be as predictable as people think. As regards Australia and New Zealand, there's no prospect at the moment, despite the very vociferous Republican movement in Australia. There's been evidently a downswing in support for a republic, and I don't see these things as quite as inevitable as people always predict. People have been predicting it for years, 20, 30 years ago. And it hasn't happened in Australia, and I think they might well be predicting it in another 20 or 30 years. So, let's see what happens. But clearly, countries will evaluate their relationship with the monarchy. That's inevitable, but I don't think it'll go just one way. I think that's truth is rarely pure and never simple, as Oscar Wilde said, and I think that's very true.
And what about you, Professor Pippa Cattrall? What is your response to that? And it isn't just the relationship with the countries of the former British Empire that has changed over the 7 decades of Elizabeth's rule. The monarchy under Charles will need to adapt to social, political, and also generational upheaval in Britain itself. Some would argue that the separation of Northern Ireland and Scotland is more possible now than before. How do you read this?
Well, first, can I just respond to something Yvonne said? She talks about hundreds of staff, but of course presidents have hundreds of staff as well. There are loads of people who work in the White House. There are loads of people who work in the Elysee Palace for President Macron and so on. So getting rid of a monarchy doesn't mean you get rid of all of that. The monarch, the person of the monarch, as opposed to the institution of the crown, costs on average about 50p per person per year, which is a bit less than the membership of the EU was costing. And of course, the British public rightly or wrongly came to the view that that was far too much. But 20,000 people in Brussels as a policy-making elite is actually a pretty small cost. So I think you've always got to put these kinds of things in context. In terms of the question of referendums and so on, I mean, I don't see much appetite for a referendum in the UK in the future. The last one arguably has still got to bed down in terms of the consequences thereof. I'm not sure that we'll see a ready enthusiasm for referendums in other places either. As Yvonne was saying earlier, the thing which most people are probably most concerned about is the cost of living crisis and the climate change and things like that. And these are, I think, rather more important than worrying about who your head of state is. All that stuff about the decline of monarchy, well, yes, in a sense that we have seen a decline of the kind of monarchy we see in Britain, but we've still got hereditary presidents in Syria and so on. So the notion that you call it a republic doesn't necessarily mean it's a republic. And indeed, one could argue, as Montesquieu did as long ago as the 18th century, that Britain is a republic in the sense that the res publica, the things of the public, are managed by the public. I mean, as Frank Prochaska pointed out on Australian television when they had their referendum, America has an elected president, an elected monarch. Britain, in many ways, has a hereditary president. So I think there are different ways in which you can think about these kinds of things. Whether it's going to lead to major changes, I mean, any kind of change in Northern Ireland, I think, will be down to political management or mismanagement, probably the latter, in which the monarchy may play a role in trying to manage these kinds of things in the way that King Charles III's great grandfather George V did when he went to Northern Ireland and made a very powerful speech of reconciliation in 1920. But I think that's really the kind of role that we might expect the monarchy to play, the kind of role the Queen herself played when she went to Dublin in 2011 and apologised for the events of 90 years earlier during the Anglo-Irish War, the dirty actions that were committed and the atrocities committed on both sides of that conflict. And I think that's really where a monarchy can contribute to these kinds of things in a way that perhaps an elected politician who is necessarily partisan may not be able to.
And let's bring some of the challenges that the new government has to deal with, along with King Charles III, with our own Islam Sid.
Thank you, Kareem, and welcome, dear viewers. Weeks ago, Queen Elizabeth was on the throne of Great Britain. Boris Johnson was the Prime Minister. Now Charles III is the King, and Liz Truss has taken over from Boris Johnson as Prime Minister of the UK. However, many challenges Truss will have to wrestle with in the coming months. She will have to fill in major gaps ranging from the slow economy to climate change issues. Amid the economic challenges that Truss has to cope with is the cost of living crisis, with average household energy bills have risen 54% already this year and are predicted to jump by 80% by early 2023. Inflation in the UK rose above 10% in July for the first time in 40 years, which conclude that the UK is on track for a recession by the end of the year, according to the Bank of England. Other challenges Truss and her government face after succeeding Boris Johnson, the latter could use his popularity to exercise pressure on Truss's administration on topics he cares about, including the environment. However, the biggest threat for Truss comes from her own Conservative MPs, where some say she could be even forced out of office before the next election, because many of them think she is just unqualified for the position, and her greatest difficulty now will be maintaining the party's discipline. Sunak will be even another pain in Truss's side, even he has pledged to back her government for now. But this group or his group of parliamentary party allies cannot make the same claim. Another hard task for Liz Truss is to take Scotland's or to keep Scotland's place in the UK, as Scottish nationalists are still calling for a second referendum on independence. This heavy burden is on Truss government to handle it. Last but not least, the economic challenges, where lots of things in the UK simply seem to be failing at the moment. Waiting times to receive healthcare are their longest in recent history. There are similar staffing and funding problems in social care, schools, universities, and local government. Strikes have taken place throughout the summer. The unions have called on Ms. Truss to take action to help the most vulnerable households get through the winter. In terms of immigration, which is seen as a hot-button issue for the Tory right wing, the number of people crossing the Channel has remained high despite promises that the Rwanda deportation scheme would act as a deterrent. Regarding climate change, Truss has promised to uphold the UK's commitment to achieve net zero by 2050, but doing so will be more challenging due to her promise to scrap green taxes from energy bills and reintroduce fracking in areas where it is supported. The Prime Minister might be required to justify plans at COP27, which starts in November in Egypt. Well, that's it from me, Karim. Back to you now.
Thank you. That was Islam Said, explaining the economic hardship that Britain is going to face. Now I get back to you, Dr. Yvonne. Many critics believe that Charles lacks the qualities that endeared Elizabeth to Britons of all social classes. Stories in memories, articles, and autobiographies about meeting Her Majesty often described her as simultaneously special, but also, quote, like us. Under Elizabeth, the royal family pushed a public narrative that they are inclusive of all in their realms. This image of a royal family for all Britons also took a hit with the departure and the ferocious press attacks on Prince Harry and his American wife, Meghan Markle. Reports of racially insensitive, let's say, comments by a senior royal suggested that the UK's pervasive culture of passive-aggressive racism goes all the way to the top as well. What is your comment about that?
Well, if a person of colour accuses somebody of racism, I tend to believe them. And Meghan Markle, as she was then known, has expressed concern about racism directed towards her by at least one senior royal. I've no intention of playing the guessing game, but there is a lot of white fragility at stake here. And we are seeing examples of it by the hostility directed towards Prince Harry's wife. And, you know, she is a person of colour. And when she arrived into the British royal family, a lot of people were really delighted because finally they found someone that they could identify with in this very privileged elite family. Unfortunately, we know that the couple were very unhappy. They gave up their royal roles, which is why Prince Harry was not wearing a uniform during the service. And some of your viewers may be wondering, you know, why he wasn't in uniform, whereas Prince Charles and Prince Edward were. And this is because he gave up his royal status. And that's why he wasn't in uniform. And of course, Prince Andrew, who's a disgraced member of the royal family, was also out of uniform because he has also lost his royal status. But going back to the Meghan Markle situation, as I say, if a person of colour shouts racism, I tend to give them the benefit of the doubt and I believe them.
Very nice indeed. And Professor Donald Lowry, Charles now faces the difficult task, if you want to say, of presenting himself as a monarch for all the Britons, regardless of race, social class, and nationality. How do you read this?
Because he's long made a point of being interested in other religions, in minority ethnic groups in Britain. And I think he's probably a better place than many would be to do this. As regards Meghan Markle, I feel I should I think I should say something about that. We don't entirely know, notwithstanding what she said, we don't know who said these things, and I've no doubt that certain racism does exist in Britain, obviously. But there's also a strong argument that at least many would think that she can be quite manipulative towards Harry, and one doesn't have to be Sigmund Freud to observe the way she can take his hand away and put it into her hand at various points. One should also give be a little bit broader about these things. People are complicated, and no doubt Meghan Markle is too. But as regards Charles, I think he's better placed when it comes to heading a multiracial Commonwealth. He is quite by all accounts, a tolerant man, a man who's interested in other faiths, while at the same time, as we have seen, asserting the Christian character of his own office. So I think he's probably in a good position.
Very nice indeed. And as a final question, and very briefly, Professor Pippa Captirel, since we ran out of time, how do you see the fact that Charles faces questions about his political neutrality?
Well, this is not an entirely new thing. You may have come across something called the Black Spider letters, which were finally released under Freedom of Information requests back in, I think, 2015. And these related to letters that the then Prince Charles had written to various members of the then Blair government about 10 years previously. And they make clear that Charles is not shy of giving his political opinions and asking ministers to justify themselves from what we might term a traditional, if not necessarily large C conservative point of view. And I expect that as king, he will continue to ask ministers to justify themselves. But then, of course, the traditional powers of the monarch under the semi-unwritten British Constitution are to be consulted, to advise and to warn. And I suspect Charles thought that in writing his Black Spider letters, he was doing just that.
Very nice indeed. Thank you so much, Professor Pippa Captirel, Dr. Yvonne Ridley, and Professor Donald Lowry. Thank you so much for your valuable participation in this special coverage. Of course, this special coverage continues on our channel in other languages, but that's it for us. Thank you for watching, and bye.